In the late-night moment that shook the monarchy to its core, King Charles III stumbled upon a sealed 1995 dossier labeled Camilla Confidential. What he found inside shattered him. Details of a near-fatal health crisis hidden not just from the world, but from Camilla herself triggered an emotional breakdown decades in the making. The truth he once buried to protect her now stood as undeniable proof of a love wrapped in silence and guilt. Overwhelmed by regret, Charles collapsed into tears. This wasn't just royal history uncovered, this was the king unraveling before our eyes. And nothing would ever be the same. Charles' moment of truth. It was just past midnight inside Clarence's house. The palace was silent. The only sound was the faint ticking of an antique clock as King Charles wandered the halls in search of forgotten paperwork. But in one of the study drawers, untouched for years, he found something else entirely. A thick envelope sealed, labeled an elegant script. Camilla Confidential 1995. His hands trembled as he opened it. Inside was a medical dossier stamped private, do not disclose. As he read, the words pierced deeper than any crown could protect him from. Details of a near-fatal health crisis Camilla suffered 30 years earlier. One Charles had kept hidden from everyone, even royal doctors, even his own children. It hit him like thunder. This wasn't just a file, this was a forgotten truth that he had buried, and now it stared back at him. Charles, his face paled, his knees buckled. He fell into the chair beside him, clutching the paper. His chest tightened, his throat, dried, tears hot, urgent, and unrelenting, slid down his face. No titles, no guards, no royal protocol, just a husband finally haunted by the secret he thought would protect the woman he loved. Emotional aftershock in the throne room. Moments later, Charles stormed into the throne room, papers in hand, heart exposed. Camilla turned from the window, surprised by his entrance, but what she saw next made her gasp. Charles fell to his knees before her, his hands shaking, his eyes flooded with sorrow. He held up the document like a ghost from the past. "I hid this from you. For your sake," he stammered. "But I was wrong." Camilla, his lips parted in shock. Her eyes filled instantly with tears. She reached for him, steadying his shoulders. Her own body trembled under the weight of what she didn't yet understand. There were no aides, no press, no formality, just two people facing the pain of 30 silent years. As the throne room, once the symbol of power and authority, became a sanctuary for raw human collapse. And for the first time, the king wasn't leading a nation. He was pleading with a woman he had loved in silence, and now feared he had failed. Historical context. The silent sacrifice flashback to Balmoral 1995. A young Camilla is rushed into a drawing room by aides. She's faint, pale, her breathing unsteady. A doctor whispers urgently, but the moment is carefully controlled. To the public, the palace releases only this: the lady is under the weather. Behind the scenes, it was anything but. Camilla had suffered a serious health scare, one that nearly ended in tragedy. Charles, panicked and overwhelmed, made a decision then to keep it hidden. The reasoning was layer. Part love, part fear. He believed that exposing Camilla's condition would trigger a media frenzy, invite public judgment, and reopen the gaping wound of his already turbulent personal life. So he locked away, not just from the press, but from everyone. That decision would follow him through his marriage to Diana, through his public redemption, through his eventual coronation. And now, decades later, that secret was no longer protecting anyone, it was breaking them. Andrew and discover the truth. By morning, Prince Andrew and Princess Anne had returned to the palace for a scheduled family meeting, but what they found instead was chaos. Charles and Camilla still in the throne room, surrounded by scattered papers. Camilla seated, tear-streaked, Charles pacing in silence, and spotted the document first. Her hand reached out instinctively. She read the title, then the details. Her eyes widened. "What is this?" she asked sharply. Charles turned, unable to meet her gaze. "I hid it," he admitted. "I thought it was the right thing at the time," and stepped back. Andrew stood in stunned silence. He recalled visits in 1995 where Camilla had seemed weak. Now it all made sense. "We never knew," he muttered, and voice cracked. "You let her go through that alone." Family trust, long upheld despite scandals and shifts, suddenly felt like glass under pressure. Fractured, fragile, and in that moment, even titles couldn't shield them from the guilt and grief flooding the room. Charles' regret and confession. The words came slowly, at first halting, uncertain, brittle, then like a dam collapsing under its own pressure, they spilled out in a torrent of raw confession. Charles clutched the now wrinkled dossier and trembling hands. The weight of it, not just the paper but the truth it contained, seemed to crush him from the inside. "I thought silence was compassion," he began, voice barely more than a whisper, "but I ended up causing pain." He didn't try to dress it up. He didn't blame advisors, press, or protocol. He turned inward with each sentence. He stripped away another layer of royal polish, until only the man remained exposed, vulnerable, and trembling. He admitted it. All the decision to withhold Camilla conditioned, the isolation that followed, the belief that he alone could manage the damage, that he alone should carry the burden. "I thought I was shielding her," he said, voice cracking. "From scandal, from scrutiny, from becoming another headline." But in that shielding, he confessed, he had created something far worse. A prison of silence. He admitted to keeping the crisis hidden from senior aides, ministers, even trusted doctors. No one had the full picture because Charles had convinced himself that secrecy was nobler than exposure, that silence was strength, that control was care. His breathing turned shallow as he reached the hardest part. He looked at Camilla, her eyes wet but steady, and said almost inaudibly, "I betrayed the trust of my wife and my duty as king." The room felt impossibly still. Camilla didn't shout, she didn't turn away, but her tears returned, not with fury but with release. The pain they had both carried separately and in silence now pooled between them. This was not the moment of a sovereign declaring policy. It was a man surrendering his illusions, acknowledging the cost of every choice made behind closed doors. He spoke of the years he watched Camilla smile through appearances, never realizing how deeply she had buried the hurt. He remembered dinners where she'd gone, quiet engagements she nearly cancelled. He had chalked it up to fatigue, but now he saw it for what it was, a slow erosion of self, one he had silently allowed. "I wrapped you in silence, I certs," he said, and called it love. But love doesn't silence. It listens. That line hung in the air, stark, broken, true. And in that confession, Charles wasn't wearing the crown, he wasn't leading a monarchy, he was simply a man, aged and aching, begging for forgiveness, not just from the woman beside him, but from the reflection he could no longer avoid in that moment. He wasn't or ruler at all. He was a husband who had finally admitted he got it wrong, and the hardest part, he knew there were no words left to fix it, only whatever came next. Relating to Diana's legacy. After the emotional storm settled, Charles found himself alone again in the Royal study. The thick velvet drapes filtered the afternoon light into a somber grey. The room, once filled with voices and confrontation, was now heavy with silence. But to Charles it wasn't just silence. It was a haunting. He sat by the window, his fingers gently tracing the edges of the now crumpled medical dossier, his mind replaying a name he hadn't spoken aloud that day, but whose presence lingered like perfume in the air. "Diana." He whispered it quietly, like an apology sent into the stillness. She wasn't just a memory now, she was a shadow that moved through the corridors, a voice that lived in every quiet pause between heartbeats. In that moment, Charles wasn't simply haunted by what he had done, he was haunted by what he had failed to do. His mind reeled back through time, the relentless flashbulbs, the tabloid headlines, the documentaries. Diana in tears on camera. Diana alone at royal events, Diana reaching out and being met not with warmth, but with silence. Her battles with depression, her cries for help, or openness once seen as vulnerability, had been picked apart by the world. But at least it had been seen. Camilla had never had that. Her pain had been hidden, wrapped in secrecy, shielded from the public, but also from support, from recognition, from healing. Charles looked down at the dossier again and whispered, "I failed both women in different ways." Diana had suffered, publicly exposed, yes, but known. Camilla had suffered in the shadows, protected, yes, but forgotten, and both had been left aching, unseen, unheard. Charles realized he had called it protection when in truth it was avoidance. He hadn't been shielding these women from the world, he had been shielding himself from confrontation, from judgment, from his own discomfort. The monarchy had taught him that silence was strength, that privacy preserved power, but now all he could see was how that silence had created distance. He remembered Diana's infamous quote, "There were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded." And now here he was decades later, realizing there had always been a 4th figure in the room. Secrecy. It had shadowed every conversation, shaped every decision, and widened every emotional gap. Charles leaned back in the chair and shut his eyes. He could almost hear her voice. He could almost feel the weight of her judgment, not as a scorned wife, but as a mother, a woman, a human being who had tried to be honest in a world that punished truth. In the quiet of that study, guilt wrapped around him like a shroud. For the first time, he wasn't thinking like a king or a husband or even a father. He was simply a man who had loved and lost both women he once vowed to protect, and now the echoes of that loss were louder than ever. Camilla, his emotional breaking point. Camilla had spent most of the day behind closed doors, cloaked not in royal gowns or protocol but in silence. She didn't speak during meetings, she didn't eat, and when aides gently knocked to check on her, she offered only a faint nod. Behind those doors, she was no longer the queen consort. She was simply a woman, and done by memory. The tears came in waves, sometimes quietly, sometimes violently. There was no one to console her. She didn't ask for comfort. For decades, Camilla had learned to carry her pain in silence, to a strength like armor. But today, the weight became too much. By evening, something inside her shifted. She didn't some stylists, she didn't fix her makeup, she didn't even smooth her hair. She just walked deliberately, slowly down the corridor toward the study. Not to address the nation, not to follow tradition, or to confront the man she loved and the truth they had buried together. She found Charles sitting in the same spot he'd occupied since the morning, the dossier still on the table, his face blank with exhaustion. He didn't look up as she entered. He didn't need to. He felt her presence like a change in the air. She sat down across from him. No guards, no aides. Just two hearts full of words long unspoken. I needed to be seen as strong, she began, her voice calm, but trembling, and I let you make that decision. Charles looked up slowly, pain behind his eyes, but said nothing. Camilla continued, I wanted the world to believe I could handle anything, that I was worthy of standing next to you. So I said yes to silence. I said yes to disappearing. Her voice cracked, but she pushed through. But I didn't realize hiding it meant hiding me. Charles tried to speak, his mouth opening with remorse. But Camilla raised her hand, gentle but firm, and stopped him. I wasn't your partner in that moment, she whispered. I was a patient behind a curtain, a ghost in my own story. And then it all spilled. Her eyes flooded, her shoulders shook, and decades of resilience came undone. Tears fell, not just for the pain she'd endured, but for the years she'd spent pretending it hadn't mattered. Charles began to cry, too, not out of guilt alone, but out of finally seeing the depth of what his silence had cost her. 4 years Camilla had been cast as the steady one, the unbreakable royal, the woman who endured scandal, criticism, and whispers without flinching. But now, in this wrong moment, she revealed a side the world had never truly seen, not a queen behind glass. There's not a villain rewritten by history, but a woman. Wounded, complex, and heartbreakingly human. And from this emotional breaking point, something changed. No longer would Camilla be viewed as just a figure beside the throne. She had become something far more powerful, a voice the world could finally hear. And fierce reaction. The next day, Princess Anne called a meeting. No palisades, no scripted agendas, just the immediate royal family gathered in a private chamber. She didn't wait for small talk. Why was this hidden? She demanded, holding up the now infamous dossier. Camilla suffered. The pub could have supported her. We could have supported her. Charles tried to explain that he feared the backlash, that he was protecting Camilla, his image, that the scandal could have consumed them both. And reply came fast, loud, and sharp. You didn't protect her. You isolated her. There's a difference. For an who valued duty with brutal honesty, this secrecy was not strength, it was betrayal. She had stood by the royal code for decades, but in this moment she found herself questioning it, all of it. The people have a right to know, she said. Camilla has a right to her story. Her voice broke. She wasn't just angry, she was hurt. For decades and had been the royal family's quiet anchor. But this time she didn't want stability. She wanted truth, and her fury made one thing undeniable: the royal family's loyalty to secrecy, and cost them far more than public opinion. It had cost them each other. William and Harry enter the fray. It didn't take long for the news to reach Prince William and Prince Harry, both abroad. When the revelation broke, within hours private jets were airborne. Within a day both sons had returned to London. They walked into Clarence's house separately. but with the same expression: shock, confusion, grief. They found Charles and Camilla seated together, quiet. The dossier once again lay on the table between them. William spoke first. "Why didn't you tell us?" he asked, voice tight. "Why didn't you defend her when it mattered?" Harry followed, quieter but sharper. "This secrecy. This is what hurt Mom too." Charles had no easy answers. He looked at both of them, his heirs, his sons, and realized the true cost of his decisions. William recalled moments when the press attacked Camilla, and he'd remained silent and sure of what was true. "If we'd known, we could have protected her too," he said. Harry added, "The institution always talks about unity, but how can we be united when we're left in the dark?" It wasn't just about Camilla anymore. It was about patterns of concealment, control, and emotional detachment. For the first time, all four sat together, not as monarchs or heirs, but as a fractured family, trying to make sense of their shared pain. Media and public response. When the story finally reached the press, it detonated like a bomb. Tabloids lead with dramatic headlines: "The King's Hidden Letter," "Camilla, his secret health crisis," "Charles is Greg down, 30 years of silence ends in tears." Television anchors struggled to balance tone, part sympathy, part scandal. But one thing was undeniable: the public was riveted. Social media surged with hashtags "Homie to me," "I'd urge Bose Pusher Aya," "Camilla revealed Shah royal truth," "Farage, 30 years, silent," and something surprising happened. The public rallied behind Camilla, not out of royal loyalty, but out of human empathy. People related to her story, to the loneliness, to the strength, to the years of invisibility finally brought into the light. Polls showed an overwhelming shift. Support for Charles' emotional honesty soared. Camilla, his approval ratings, long a point of contention, rose sharply. People weren't angry she was ill, they were angry they never knew. Commentators debated the fallout. Was Charles a protective husband or a paternalistic gatekeeper? Was this act of secrecy born from love or from control? The media frenzy was relentless, but this time it wasn't just about scandal. It was about change, and the royal family, whether ready or not, had been dragged into a new era of public vulnerability, expert insight, and royal reform. As public emotions surged, the experts moved in not to analyze scandal, but to dissect something far deeper: the psychological, political, and institutional fallout of a king's silence. Psychologists spoke first. They explained that long-term secrecy, especially within a high-pressure system like royalty, often leads to emotional compartmentalization, shutting off pain in order to function. But what Charles had done wasn't just about compartmentalizing, it was about burying an entire chapter of someone else's suffering. One renowned therapist said bluntly, "Silence can feel like safety, but in the long run it fractures trust." Marriage counselors took it further. They noted that many couples, especially those living under scrutiny, develop a protective secrecy to shield one another. But if not shared, those secrets become walls, not shields. Camilla and Charles had loved each other fiercely, but the cost of that love was isolation disguised as protection. Royal analysts turned the focus to policy. If a senior royal's health crisis could be kept hidden for 30 years, even from immediate family, what else remained buried behind palace doors? The public demanded answers, and behind the scenes, palace advisors were scrambling to catch up. Proposals began forming. One suggested mandatory health disclosures for working royals overseen by an independent medical board. Another pushed for a new internal body made up of psychologists, counselors, and transparency advocates tasked with identifying and preventing emotional silencing within the institution. Body language experts added fuel to the conversation. They pointed out the way Charles now leaned into Camilla during public appearances, the way her voice was allowed to rise uninterrupted. "This isn't performance," one expert said, "it's emotional recalibration. A new power dynamic is forming." Public relations firms to soar opportunity. This could be a pivot point, one strategist explained, from mystery to humanity, from stoic symbols to real people. The monarchy, long praised for its polished restraint, was now facing a question it had long avoided: could emotional honesty be its next evolution? The answer, it seemed, was already unfolding in real time. Official palace statement. 3 days after the revelations, the world waited for Buckingham Palace to speak. When it finally did, it didn't arrive in the form of a cold press release. It came as a televised address from the king himself. Dressed in a simple black suit without regalia or backdrop, Charles faced the camera as himself, not just the monarch, but the man who had made a terrible decision. 30 years ago he began, "I made a choice to shield the woman I love from a world that had not yet learned to be kind." He admitted to hiding Camilla's illness. He admitted to doing so without her full voice in the matter, and most of all, he admitted that in protecting her image he had buried all truth. Then came the pivot. He turned to Camilla seated beside him for the final portion and invited her to speak. Her voice, calm but quivering, thanked the public for their compassion. "I didn't ask for sympathy," she said, "but I am grateful for the grace you've shown me." Together they unveiled a new royal initiative focusing on health transparency and emotional education across the Commonwealth.